A century ago, one railroad did the impossible. It strung electric wire across 656 miles of the American West, running silent trains over the Rockies while the rest of the country still burned coal. The locomotives could haul 3,000 tons up a mountain pass at 16 miles per hour, nearly twice the speed of any steam engine alive. When those trains rolled downhill, they didn't burn fuel. They generated electricity and fed it back into the wire for other trains to use. It was the longest mainline railroad electrification in the world, and it was decades ahead of its time. Then, almost overnight, the company tore the wires down, ripped out the copper, scrapped the locomotives. And within 6 years of pulling the plug, the railroad was dead, its track abandoned from Montana to Washington in the largest single railroad abandonment in American history. The reason still stuns engineers, because the numbers show that killing the electrification cost more than keeping it. By the end of this video, you'll know how much the railroad actually paid to destroy its own advantage, what they got for the copper they were so desperate to sell, and the single engineering decision, made 50 years earlier, that haunted the line until the day it died. The story begins with a railroad that had everything except a way to reach the ocean. The Chicago, Milwaukee and St. Paul Railway, the Milwaukee Road, was one of the most prosperous railroads in America at the turn of the 20th century. Its 11,000 miles of track covered the Midwest from Chicago to Minneapolis, Omaha, and Kansas City. But the railroad's western boundary was the Missouri River. Beyond it, two rivals, the Great Northern and the Northern Pacific, controlled the routes to the Pacific coast and all the trade that came with it. The Milwaukee's board decided that the only way to compete was to build their own transcontinental line. And unlike their competitors, they'd do it without a single acre of government land. Construction began in 1906. Over the next 3 years, the Milwaukee Road built 2,300 miles of new track from South Dakota to Puget Sound, purchasing every inch of right-of-way from private landowners. No government land grants, no congressional subsidies. Every acre paid for at market price. The line crossed 5 mountain ranges: the Belts, the Rockies, the Bitterroots, the Saddle Mountains, and the Cascades, at grades so precisely engineered that the route was shorter than both the Great Northern and the Northern Pacific. Thousands of workers, Italians, Serbs, Montenegrins, Austrians, Japanese, Irish, Swedes, blasted tunnels through granite, hung trestles across canyons, and laid rail across some of the most punishing terrain in North America. The Kelly Creek Trestle alone, 850 feet long, 230 feet above the valley floor, was built by a 25-man crew in 31 days. In May 1909, a golden spike was driven at Garrison, Montana, and the last great transcontinental railroad in American history was open for business. It was a triumph of engineering and speed. Many historians rank the construction of 2,300 miles in 3 years as equal to the Central Pacific's legendary 10 miles in a day push. It was also a financial time bomb. The construction costs were staggering, far beyond original estimates, and the railroad had taken on massive debt to build a line through territory where 2 well-established competitors already operated. The Milwaukee Road needed an edge, and it found one underground. The Butte, Anaconda, and Pacific Railway, a copper mining railroad in Montana, had converted from steam to electric locomotives in 1914 with impressive results. Milwaukee's engineers took notice. The mountain grades on the Pacific extension were murderous for steam engines, and hydroelectric power was abundant in the region. In 1915, the railroad made an unprecedented decision: electrify the mountain crossing. Remember this phrase, the gap. It decides everything that comes later. The first electric locomotive arrived on September 25, 1915, billed as the largest electric locomotive in the world. To justify the expense, the railroad staged a test on the brutal 1.66% grade east of Butte, climbing to the summit of Pipestone Pass at the Continental Divide. A 2-unit electric hauled a 3,000-ton train up the mountain at a steady 16 miles per hour. A steam consist with 3 locomotives on the same grade could manage only 9. The demonstration sealed the decision. By late 1916, the entire Rocky Mountain Division, 440 miles from Harleton, Montana to Avery, Idaho, was under wire. 3,000 volts of direct current hummed through copper catenary strung above the track, powering locomotives that could do something no steam engine ever could, turn their motors into generators on the downhill runs, converting the train's momentum back into electricity and feeding it into the overhead wire for other trains climbing the opposite side of the mountain. Regenerative braking. The trains going down powered the trains going up. In 1920, the railroad electrified a second stretch, 207 miles from Othello, Washington, to Tacoma, across the Cascade Range. The Milwaukee Road now operated the longest electrified mainline railroad on Earth, 656 miles of wire across 4 mountain ranges. But between those 2 electrified divisions sat 216 miles of nothing. No wire, no substations, no electric power, just diesel territory. A gap that would haunt the railroad for half a century. The gap meant that every train crossing the Rockies and the Cascades had to change locomotives twice, swapping between electric and diesel power at each end of the unelectrified section. It added hours to transit times, required extra crews, and meant the railroad could never run a seamless electric service from Montana to the coast. Study after study showed that closing the gap would pay for itself in operational savings. General Electric even offered to underwrite the entire cost of modernizing the electric system and bridging the unelectrified section, roughly $39 million. The Milwaukee Road's management said no. Every time. Think about that number, $39 million. Hold it in your mind. For decades, the electrification worked brilliantly despite the gap. The electric locomotives outperformed everything else on the railroad. Cheaper to run, more powerful on grades, more reliable in the brutal Montana winters, where diesel fuel thickened and steam engines choked on frozen water. By the 1960s, the railroad's fleet included the legendary Little Joes, massive electric locomotives originally built for the Soviet Union, but diverted to American railroads after the Cold War made delivery impossible. They were the workhorses of the Rocky Mountain Division, hauling freight over Pipestone Pass with an efficiency that diesel could not match. And then the men in the boardroom made their move. In the late 1960s, a new management team under President William Quinn decided the electrification had to go. The argument was that diesel technology had improved, that maintaining the catenary infrastructure was expensive, and that the copper in the overhead wire was worth a fortune. Copper prices had spiked. Management looked at 500 miles of wire and saw a payday. The Coast Division electrification was shut down on November 13, 1972. The wires came down, the copper was stripped, the substations were closed, and the railroad placed orders for diesel locomotives to replace the electrics. Here is where the mathematics of catastrophe become undeniable. The Milwaukee Road spent $39 million, the exact same amount General Electric had offered to modernize the entire system, buying diesel locomotives to replace the electrics. And the copper they'd been so eager to sell. By the time the wire came down, prices had crashed. The railroad received $5 million for scrap that management had expected would bring in 10. They spent $39 million and recovered 5, and the diesels they bought to replace the electrics. By 1974, the year the last electric locomotive made its final run, the electric fleet had been operating at half the cost of the diesels that were supposed to improve efficiency. And 1974 was the year the Arab oil embargo sent diesel fuel prices through the roof. The Milwaukee Road had scrapped its electrification just in time to be hit by the worst energy crisis in modern history. The timing was almost satirical. As every other railroad in America scrambled to study electrification, Burlington Northern, Santa Fe, Union Pacific, Southern Pacific all commissioned feasibility reports on converting their mountain routes to electric operation. The Milwaukee Road was the one railroad that already had it and had just torn it out. 656 miles of infrastructure that the entire industry was suddenly desperate to build, sold for scrap copper at 5 cents on the dollar. The rest of the industry looked at the Milwaukee and saw a cautionary tale. Then they looked at the price of rebuilding from scratch and decided diesel was cheaper after all. The moment passed. Nobody electrified. Without its electric advantage, the Milwaukee Road's Pacific extension began to die, and the competitive landscape had shifted beneath it. In 1970, the Great Northern and the Northern Pacific, the Milwaukee's two original rivals, merged into Burlington Northern, creating a single colossal railroad that now dominated the Northern Transcontinental Corridor. The Milwaukee was a weakened carrier, fighting a combined enemy with deeper pockets, better track, and no interest in sharing freight. The money that should have maintained the Milwaukee's track had been spent on diesel locomotives that performed worse than the electrics they replaced. Rail conditions deteriorated, speed restrictions multiplied. By 1977, transit times on the Pacific extension had nearly tripled. Freight that once crossed Montana in hours now crawled. Shippers took their business to Burlington Northern. Revenue collapsed. On December 19, 1977, the Milwaukee Road filed for bankruptcy. It was the railroad's third. It had gone bankrupt in 1925 and again in 1935, but this time there would be no recovery. The trustee examined the books and recommended the unthinkable: abandon the entire Pacific extension. And then something emerged from the accounting that made the decision even more devastating. Investigators discovered that the railroad's own bookkeeping had been systematically overstating the costs of the western lines. Expenses were being double-counted. Revenue was being undercounted. The Pacific extension, which management had spent a decade arguing was a financial sinkhole, may have been one of the only profitable parts of the railroad. By the time anyone figured it out, it was too late. In the winter of 1980, the Milwaukee Road abandoned almost 2,000 miles of track west of Miles City, Montana. From the prairies of eastern Montana, across the Continental Divide, through the Bitterroot Canyons, over the Columbia Plateau, and into the foothills of the Cascades, every mile of it surrendered. It was the largest single railroad abandonment in American history. The track that 2,300 workers had laid across 5 mountain ranges in 3 years, the tunnels they'd bored, the trestles they'd hung over canyon walls, the substations they'd built to power silent trains across the Continental Divide, all of it was left to rust, to weather, and to the slow reclamation of the wilderness. Depots were boarded up. Signal posts stood guard over empty grade crossings. The catenary poles, stripped bare, lined the right-of-way like a row of crucifixes marking the grave of something that should have lived. The Soo Line, a subsidiary of Canadian Pacific, acquired what remained of the Milwaukee Road in 1986. The company that had once operated the longest electrified railroad on Earth was absorbed into a Canadian railroad that had no use for its western ambitions. But the right-of-way didn't vanish. The roadbed, the tunnels, and the trestles proved too well engineered to disappear. Washington State purchased the Milwaukee's right-of-way for just $1.9 million in 1981. An entire transcontinental corridor sold for less than the price of a single modern locomotive. In the decades since abandonment, hundreds of miles of the Pacific extension have been converted into rail trails. The route of the Hiawatha, crossing the Bitterroot Mountains between Montana and Idaho, takes cyclists and hikers through 10 tunnels and over 7 trestles, including the mile-and-a-half-long St. Paul Pass Tunnel beneath the Continental Divide. The Palouse to Cascades Trail in Washington stretches 300 miles across the state on the old Milwaukee roadbed. In Montana, the route of the Olympian follows the abandoned track through the mountains where the Little Joes once hauled 5,000-ton trains in silence. The tunnels are dark, The rails are gone, but the engineering is still there, carved into the mountains, exactly where those 2,300 workers left it more than a century ago. There's a historical marker at Deer Lodge, Montana, on the old Electrified line. It reads, "Milwaukee's management pushed to replace the electrics with diesels in the late 1960s. They discovered that diesels did not perform as well and cost more to operate." That's the whole story in 2 sentences. A railroad that built something extraordinary, proved it worked, and then destroyed it because a boardroom in Chicago decided copper was worth more than the future. Would you have ripped the wires down? If you were sitting in that boardroom in 1972, staring at the copper prices and the diesel brochures, would you have taken the money? Or would you have bet the company on the technology that was already working? Because the rest of the American railroad industry is still asking that question. Not a single Class I freight railroad in the United States runs electric trains today. If the Milwaukee Road's collapse kept you watching, the story of what happened to the other great American railroads in the 1970s is even darker. The Penn Central bankruptcy made the Milwaukee look small, and the wreckage it left behind built something no one expected.